Hello dear students, it's your computer teacher, and today we will continue with the same chapter, that is chapter number 5, which deals with the topic constructor in Java. So my dear students, in our previous class we have started a new chapter named constructor, and in that particular class we have learned what is a constructor, characteristics of a constructor, why constructor is needed, and we also have learned about the basic way of writing the constructor type program. So my dear students, in today's class we will be learning about types of Java constructor. So there are altogether two different types of Java constructor, which are default constructor and parameterized constructor. So the two different types of constructor are default constructor and parameterized constructor. So sometimes question may come there in the exam. Write the two different types of Java constructor. So at the time you have to write default constructor and parameterized constructor. So today we will be dealing with these two different types of constructor. So now the main function of a constructor is to initialize the data members of an object while it is created. So in our previous class we have learned about constructor. So what is actually a constructor is, it is a member method which has got same name as that of a class. Now while dealing with constructor, what is the first thing that you have to remember is we have to create an object in order to initialize any of the data there in the program. So the main function of a constructor is to initialize the data members of an object while it is created. So while it is created, the main motive, the main function of a constructor is to initialize the data. Now constructor can be broadly categorized into two categories based on the parameters it takes as. So it is broadly categorized into two different categories. The first one is default constructor. So what is a default constructor is a constructor that takes no parameters. Parameters means arguments. Now if a constructor does not take any parameters, so that kind of constructor is called as default constructor. And second kind of constructor is parameterized constructor. So a constructor that takes one or more parameters, that type of constructor is called as parameterized constructor. So now let us start with the first constructor, that is default constructor. So another name for a default constructor is non-parameterized constructor. So sometimes during exam time it may come as what is non-parameterized constructor. So at that time please don't get confused with default and non-parameterized constructor. So both are same. So sometimes instead of default, so in exam it may ask with another name, that is non-parameterized constructor. So question may come, what is non-parameterized constructor, or define non-parameterized constructor. So at that time you can write the same definition of default constructor. So a constructor that takes no parameters is called as a default constructor. It will have the name of the class and has no return type. So in constructor will not have any kind of return type and not even void. So this were the thing that was taught in previous class also during dealing with the characteristics of a constructor. So it will have the name of the class and have no return type. So constructor will not have any kind of return type. If you do not write a constructor in your program, the compiler will supply a default constructor and initialize values with the default values of the primitive data types. So now what happens there in the default constructor is, now if you don't write a constructor, as I told you, a constructor will be having same name as that of a class. So for example, if I give class name as book, so the name of the constructor also will be as book only. So now if you do not write a constructor in your program, the compiler will supply a default constructor. So if you don't write any constructor at that time, compiler automatically supplies a default constructor, and it initializes values with the default values of the primitive data types. So what compiler does is, after supplying a default constructor, now it starts giving the default value of primitive data types. So in Java there are altogether 8 different primitive data types, and I have taught you the default value of the primitive data types that is provided by Java. For example, for Boolean data type, the default value is false. Similarly, for integer data type, the default value is 0. Like string, for string, the default value will be null. So these are the different data types, and these are the different default values of primitive data types that is provided by Java. So these are already taught in the class. Now that is integer values to 0, floating point variables to 0.0, and string to null. So as I told you, it will initialize the default values of the primitive data types. Like here the example is given, that is integer values to 0, floating point variables to 0.0, and string to null. So if we don't write a constructor there in the program, at that time what happens is compiler automatically supplies a default constructor, and it also initializes the default value of primitive data type. Now if you look here in this slide, just below this paragraph, what is given is syntax is written. So default constructor also has got its own way to write the programming block. So syntax, class name. So how to write the default constructor? So if you look carefully here, what is given is, it starts with class name. So class name can be anything. So here this is just a basic way to write the default constructor type program. So it starts with class name. Now after class name, what you can see here is bracket is there, open bracket and close bracket, and you can see there is nothing inside that bracket. That means parameters are not given or not stored inside that bracket. So what kind of constructor is used here is default constructor. So constructor is given here class name, and it does not have any sort of parameters inside the bracket. Now just below the class name, a curly braces has been opened, and data member 1 equals to value 1, data member 2 equals to value 2 is given. So here different data members will be stored according to the user or according to the programmer. Now equals to assignment operator is used, equals to value 1. So at that time, if default value is or default constructor is used, so here in value 1 and value 2, what will be given is default value of primitive data type will be given. Suppose for example data member 1, suppose if it stores name, for example RAM. So RAM, for RAM the data type used will be string. So equals to, what will be as the default value for string is null. So equals to, in place of value 1, what will be given is the default value of string will be written. Now I'd like to show one example for this default constructor. So here is an example of default constructor where you can see a class name given out there. So constructor also will be having same name as that of a class. So whatever class name you give, the same thing will be as constructor. So here public book is the constructor. Now public book is a constructor, name of a constructor, and there is nothing inside the bracket. That means this is a default constructor. So that is why I have written a comment out there. So default constructor. Now after that, next line is to open the curly braces, and after that what you can see is different data members along with its default value. So there are altogether 3 different data members given. The first one is book number equals to 0. So number means what kind of data type we have to use is int. So since it is dealing with number, so what will be the default value for number or integer is 0. So equals to 0. Similarly for second one, b name. So for name, the data type used will be string. So equals to the default value of string, that is null. So double inverted comma open, double inverted comma close, and inside that abc is written. So this is the null or the default value for string. Similarly for third one, price. So for price, the data type used will be float, and float deals with decimal numbers, and for float the default value is 0.0. So that is the thing that is given in the right portion of the third data member. So after that, next line you see the closing curly braces. So this is how we have to write the default constructor. So in default constructor, what you have to keep in mind is there won't be any arguments or parameters inside the bracket. So where you have written the constructor name, so there you cannot see any sort of arguments or parameters inside the bracket. So if you see any sort of parameters inside the bracket, so that particular constructor is considered as the parameterized constructor. So since here in this example there are no parameters given inside the bracket, so this is considered as default constructor. Now this will be invoked when you create the object without any parameter. So here this will be working, these data members will be working if you create an object. So it is very much necessary to create an object there in the constructor type program. So if you create an object, then only these members will be invoked. So how to create an object, I have already taught in the class. So the object can be created with the help of a new keyword. So if you see just below this sentence, creation of object statement is given. Like for this example, book obj equals to new book. So this is how we have to create an object. So this object is created here in this example for invoking the thing that is given inside this small block. So this is how we have to create an object for rest of the constructor type programming also. Now the second type of constructor is parameterized constructor. So a constructor that takes one or more parameters or arguments is called as parameterized constructor. So a constructor or parameterized constructor is defined as a constructor which takes one or more parameters or arguments. So those kind of constructor is called as parameterized constructor. Such a constructor will accept values and initialize the data members with the corresponding values. There is no limitation to the number of parameters. So we can include as many parameters we want inside the bracket of parameterized constructor. So syntax is given for this parameterized constructor also. Like here, what is the difference between the default constructor and the parameterized constructor is we can easily make it out with the help of the first portion only. Like here, class name, and inside the bracket what is given is type 1 val1 comma type 2 val2 dot dot dot. We can include some more parameters inside the bracket. So type 1 val1, these are the different parameters. and a small comment is given, that is parameter list. So that means here in this particular portion different parameters has been included. So that is why a comment is given in order to know who is reading this particular programming portion. So for them a small comment has been given, that is parameter list. So inside the bracket these are called as parameters and these are in more number. So that is why parameter list comment has been mentioned out here. Now next line is opening of curly braces, then again the same thing, data member 1 equals to val1, data member 2 equals to val2. After that closing of curly braces for the constructor or the class. So this is how you have to write the portion for the parameterized constructor. Now I like to explain this syntax or parameterized constructor with one example that is given here in this slide. Now book intx, so something is given inside the bracket. So name of a constructor is book and inside the bracket what is given is intx. So intx is considered here as parameter. So parameterized constructor. So next line is curly braces open. Now book number equals to x. So book number is given as data members here and equals to x is the value that is given for the data member. So book number equals to x means book number is data member and equals to x is a value for that particular data member. And the next line is to close the curly braces for this constructor. Now again this will be working if we create an object. So these data members can be invoked if we create an object. So how to create an object for this parameterized constructor also is by the help of new keyword. So book obj equals to new book. So this is the statement to create a new object there in a constructor type program. So my dear students, so these are the two different types of constructors, and sometimes in exam what is asked is write the syntax of parameterized constructor, or sometimes it may ask as write the syntax for default constructor. So at that time you have to write the portion which is given here in this slide, the lower portion, and similarly for default constructor it is given out here. So this picture is clicked from your computer application textbook page number 123, 24 and 25. So you just can refer your computer application textbook for more detail. So this much for today, and in upcoming classes we'll be learning some more constructor type programming. So till then, stay safe, stay healthy, dedicate your time in studies. Thank you.